This program is brought to you by realestate.com.au, Australia's #1 address in property. With more properties for sale than anywhere else, we make it easier.
Welcome back. Time to take a look at this weekend's auctions, where there's about 3,700 properties up for sale. Starting in Sydney, there'll be 980 auctions, another 225 around New South Wales. Melbourne will have the most auctions with about 1,600 and another 115 in Victoria. In Queensland, there'll be 230 auctions in Brisbane and about 180 around the state. In Adelaide, 218 properties will go under the hammer, with just another 9 across the state. Lastly, in the capital, Canberra, 144 properties will go to auction. On to the most viewed properties going to auction this weekend. Top of the list, 182 Fitzroy Street in the Melbourne suburb of Fitzroy. It's got a price guide of $2.75 to $2.95 million. Property was formerly a church hall and a kindergarten before undergoing extensive renovations. Next on the list, we've got 27 Rose Street, Glenelg, that's in Adelaide, followed by 222 Reserve Road, Beaumaris, a Bayside suburb in Melbourne. That's got a price guide of $3.8 million. Lastly, we have 61A Roslyn Street, Brighton, also in Melbourne, and 14 Delay Avenue, Borkham Hills in Sydney. This week, the most viewed residential listings, apartment 7, number 58 to 64 Chestnut Street in Cremorne, Victoria. It's pretty close to the Melbourne Cricket Ground. This one is a little different to the homes we usually see take the top listing. It's a tiny 41 square metre apartment with 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom and a car space. The vendors have renovated the property, which has double glazed windows. The unit is a short stroll from everything the Richmond area has to offer, including the MCG, great cafes and Swan Street nightlife. The real drawcard to this property is the price, $399,000. I'd hazard a guess and say this property has received so many clicks due to that price. Well, joining me now is Anne Flaherty, Economist at REA Group. Anne, thanks so much for your time. Let's start with the amount of properties going to auction this weekend. About 3,700. Seems like there's a lot of stock right now.
There's absolutely a lot of stock right now. The number of properties that are hitting the market are well above what we typically see for the time of year, and it is always a strong time of year leading up to the Easter holidays and coming into that, autumn selling season. So we've seen since the start of the year, actually, the volume of properties selling has been quite elevated. So it's good news for buyers. There's a lot of choice out there at the moment.
And that autumn selling season that we're getting into, is that also a busy time of the year for property, or does property sales sort of start to ease off a little bit?
Well, what we see is that a lot of people typically try and get their properties sold in the lead up to the Easter holidays. There's generally a bit of a lull in the market once Easter hits. It's the school holidays, people are away. So there's often that push to get properties sold before Easter hits.
Well, look, and the federal government completed its inquiry into housing affordability last week. And were there any key findings in that particularly interested you?
Yeah, look, the inquiry actually put together 16 different recommendations. I'll touch on a couple that I think are quite important. The first one is, one really important thing is the fact that the number of new properties being constructed has not kept up with Australia's growing population over the last decades. Now, we know that, when we've got a growing number of people looking to buy a smaller number of properties, that adds further fuel to that price growth. So some recommendations that were put forward by the inquiry were to increase density limits in a lot of areas. Particularly, I think this is important, and the report agrees, along those corridors that already have good transport infrastructure, particularly areas where that transport infrastructure is currently underutilised. Another suggestion made by the report that I think the majority of economists agree on, which is always exciting when the majority of economists agree on anything, is the need to reform stamp duty. It's an extremely inefficient tax. It makes the market less mobile. People stay in their properties longer. And in addition, the people who are hit hardest by housing affordability are first home buyers. And it's that deposit hurdle, that upfront cost. And what stamp duty does is it just pushes up that upfront cost. It makes it even harder to enter the market. And one of the things that's compounding the issue of stamp duty is the fact that we've seen significant bracket creep over the last decades. You know, the way stamp duty is calculated has not kept up with the rate at which property prices have grown, and people are forking out more and more and more.
Yes, saving for a house deposit, that's a big roadblock for so many Australians out there. I think the inquiry recommended Aussies should be able to access their superannuation as security for this loan. What do you make of that recommendation from the report?
Look, I think that there are other measures that should be prioritised before we start going into superannuation. You know, the biggest hurdle is faced by first home buyers, and if we look at that younger cohort of buyers, their balance in their superannuation funds is actually really quite low. You know, it's kind of insubstantial. So I think that it's not going to have too much of an impact. The other thing is that what this could end up doing is actually pushing up prices further. So in some ways, it might even counterbalance, you know, what benefit could come from this scheme.
Well, Anne Flaherty, Economist at REA Group, thanks so much for your time this afternoon.
My pleasure.